The last thing I had from my husband, my daughter threw away like garbage. I still remember the sound the trash bin made when I opened the lid. That hollow metal echo. At my age, sounds stay with you longer than faces sometimes. The creak of old floorboards. The whistle of a pressure cooker. The crack in your voice when you say a dead man's name after too many years. And that sound. That terrible sound. I stood there in the alley behind my daughter's house with my slippers soaked from the rain, staring into black garbage bags filled with rotten vegetables, broken boxes, and coffee grounds. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the lid open. Because somewhere in that trash were 63 letters my husband had written to me over 42 years of marriage. Letters he wrote when he worked nights at the railway station. Letters he wrote when he was away during floods. Letters he wrote after our biggest fights. Letters he wrote when we had no money for proper food but still somehow found enough love to survive. And my daughter had thrown them away like they meant nothing. People think old women cry loudly. We don't. Not when the pain is real. Real pain becomes quiet. It sits in your chest like a stone. I didn't scream when I realized the wooden box was missing from my closet. I didn't accuse anyone immediately. I just stood there in that spare bedroom my daughter gave me after my fall last winter, staring at the empty shelf. The square mark from the box was still there beneath the dust. That's the strange thing about loss. Sometimes what hurts most is the outline left behind. I remember touching the shelf over and over as if the box might suddenly return if I believed hard enough. My husband, Walter, built that box himself. Oh, he was terrible with measurements. God bless him. One side was slightly crooked, and the lid never closed properly. But he polished it every anniversary because he knew I loved it. Looks handmade, people used to say politely. Walter would grin proudly and answer, that's because it is. I can still see him sitting in our garage with sawdust in his hair. Lord, I loved that man. I was 19 when I met him. He had oil stains on his hands and exactly 37 cents in his pocket. But he looked at me like I was the only woman God had ever created. No one has looked at me that way since. Not even close. We built our life from almost nothing. One apartment with leaking pipes. One tiny kitchen. One secondhand mattress that squeaked every time we moved. But we laughed. Oh, how we laughed back then. Poor people laugh differently. Harder. Desperately sometimes. Like joy itself is rebellion. Walter used to leave little notes everywhere because we couldn't afford gifts. Inside flower jars. Under my pillow. Tucked into recipe books. Still crazy about you. Your soup almost killed me, but I love you anyway. My favorite sound is your laugh. Stupid little things. Beautiful little things. Then eventually the notes became letters. Especially after our daughter Emily was born. Walter worked double shifts at the railway station because babies need things love cannot buy. Formula. Medicine. Shoes every 6 months because children grow like weeds. He would leave before sunrise and come home after midnight some days. So he started writing. At first, it was just updates. Emily took 3 steps today. The landlord came again. Please don't forget to rest. But then the letters became something else. A place where we told each other truths we were too tired to speak aloud. He wrote about his fears. I wrote about loneliness. He confessed when he felt like a failure. I admitted when motherhood overwhelmed me. Do you know something strange? The deepest intimacy in my marriage happened on paper. Not in bed. Not over candlelight dinners. On paper. Ink holds honesty differently. When Walter wrote, he became softer. More open. Less afraid of sounding weak. And I kept every single letter. Every one. Even the angry ones. Especially the angry ones. Because those mattered too. Young people today think love means never hurting each other. That's nonsense. Real love survives hurt. Real love survives unpaid bills and funerals and disappointments and saying cruel things during exhaustion. Real love survives becoming strangers for a little while and choosing each other again anyway. Those letters told the story of that survival. 42 years of survival. And now they were gone. At first, I told myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe Emily moved the box while cleaning. Maybe she stored it somewhere safer. Maybe I was forgetting things again. Old people become frightened of their own memory. Every misplaced object feels like the beginning of disappearance. So I walked slowly to the kitchen where Emily stood scrolling on her phone while making coffee. She didn't even look up when I entered. "You moved my box?" I asked. "What box?" "The wooden one from my closet." Still scrolling. "Oh. That old thing?" Something inside me tightened immediately. "Yes." "Where is it?" She shrugged. "I threw it out." Just like that. No hesitation. No apology. Like she was talking about expired leftovers. I remember gripping the counter because suddenly my knees felt weak. "You threw it out?" "It was full of old papers, Mom." Old papers. That's what she called them. 42 years of love reduced to old papers. I stared at my daughter's face, searching for some sign she didn't understand what she'd done. But she was distracted. Impatient even. "You keep too much junk," she said. "I'm trying to organize the house." Junk. That word cut deeper than anything else. Because those letters were the opposite of junk. They were proof that once in this world, someone loved me completely. Do you understand what that means to an old woman? When you reach my age, people stop seeing you as someone who was once adored. They see wrinkles. Medication schedules. Slow walking. They forget you once danced barefoot in kitchens. They forget someone once kissed your neck like it was sacred. Those letters remembered for me. They reminded me I had not always been old. I think Emily noticed my face finally because she sighed dramatically. "Mom, why are you making such a big deal out of this? Why? Why?" I looked at the daughter I carried for 9 months. The daughter whose fevers I sat through all night. The daughter whose wedding dress I sewed by hand because we couldn't afford boutique prices. And suddenly, I realized something terrible. She never understood my marriage. Not really. Children only see fragments of their parents. They see rules. Arguments. Dinner on tables. But they don't see the private tenderness that holds a marriage together behind closed doors. Emily saw responsibility. She never saw romance. Walter and I protected her from our struggles so carefully that maybe we also protected her from witnessing love itself. I opened my mouth to explain. To tell her what those letters meant. But then she said something I will never forget. "You need to stop living in the past." So casually. Like it was advice. The past. As though Walter himself was just some old habit I refused to quit. My husband had been dead 6 years by then. 6 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Not that I counted anymore. That's a lie. Of course I counted. Widows always count. I whispered, those were all I had left of him. Emily rubbed her forehead like I was exhausting her. You have memories. No. No, sweetheart. Memories fade. That's the cruelty of aging. You begin losing people twice. First when they die. Then slowly in your mind. Walter's voice had already started slipping away from me some mornings. Sometimes I struggled to remember the exact shade of his eyes. But the letters kept him alive. I could hold his handwriting. See where his pen pressed harder when he was emotional. Find tiny coffee stains on pages he wrote during night shifts. Once, I even found a tear mark. One small water stain where he must have cried while writing. How do you throw away a man's tears? I didn't yell at Emily. I wish I had. Maybe anger would have hurt less than the silence that came instead. I simply turned around and walked to my room. Then I put on my coat. Where are you going? She called. I didn't answer. Because I already knew. I was going to search through garbage for the remains of my marriage. And God help me. I would have crawled through every trash bin in the city if I had to. The rain had started by then. Cold rain. The kind that settles into old bones. Emily followed me outside halfway down the driveway. Mom, stop being dramatic. Dramatic. Funny word. People use it when they don't want to face the pain they caused. I kept walking. One slow step after another toward the alley. Toward the trash bins waiting behind the row of houses. I remember neighbors watching from windows. Probably wondering why an old woman was digging through garbage in the rain. But grief destroys pride eventually. You stop caring how ridiculous you look. I opened the first bag with trembling hands. Rotten fruit. Newspapers. Milk cartons. Not there. Second bag. Third. By then my fingers smelled like spoiled food and rainwater. My back hurt terribly. But I kept searching. Because love makes fools of us until the very end. Then suddenly, I found a piece of paper. My heart nearly stopped. I unfolded it carefully with wet, shaking hands. But it wasn't Walter's letter. Just an old grocery receipt. I sat down right there on the pavement after that. Not because I wanted to. Because my body simply gave out beneath me. And for the first time since Walter died, I truly felt alone. Not widowed. Not elderly. Alone. There's a difference. A widow still feels connected to love somehow. But sitting beside those garbage bins, rain dripping down my face, I realized the last physical proof of my marriage might already be buried beneath tons of trash somewhere. Gone forever. And what frightened me most wasn't losing the letters. It was realizing my own daughter never understood why they mattered. Maybe that meant I had failed somewhere as a mother. Or maybe children today simply inherit convenience instead of sentiment. I don't know. All I know is this. When you love someone for 42 years, their handwriting becomes holy. And that night, kneeling beside garbage bags in the rain, I felt like someone had burned down my church. I stayed beside those trash bins longer than any sane person would have. Rainwater soaked through my coat until my blouse clung cold against my skin, but I barely noticed anymore. At some point, pain becomes background noise. Like an old clock ticking in another room. I kept searching. Bag after bag. My fingers cramped from pulling wet garbage apart. Banana peels stuck to my sleeves. Coffee grounds smeared across my palms. Once, I cut my thumb on a broken soup can and didn't even realize I was bleeding until I saw pink water dripping onto the pavement. Still, I searched. Because somewhere in my foolish old heart, I believed love deserved one final rescue. A neighbor named Mrs. Harper eventually opened her back door and spotted me crouched there. "Margaret," she called carefully. "Good Lord, what happened?" I looked up slowly. Have you ever noticed how humiliating grief can look from the outside? Inside yourself, it feels sacred. Monumental. Like the world should stop turning for it. But to others, it's just an old woman in the rain digging through trash. Mrs. Harper rushed over with an umbrella. "You're freezing." "I'm fine." "You are absolutely not fine." I almost laughed at that. People always say that after disaster, don't they? As if denial itself could keep tragedy from settling into the bones. She tried helping me stand, but I pulled away gently. "I need to find something." "What?" "My husband's letters." Even saying it aloud nearly broke me again. Mrs. Harper's expression softened immediately. "Oh, honey." That word. Honey. The way older women say it to each other when life becomes unbearable. She crouched beside me despite the rain ruining her shoes. "What happened?" "My daughter threw them away." For a moment, Mrs. Harper said nothing. Then quietly, "All of them?" I nodded. And something changed in her face. Not pity. Recognition. Because women our age understand what objects become after enough years pass. They stop being objects entirely. A wedding ring is no longer jewelry. A coat is no longer fabric. A handwritten letter is no longer paper. They become evidence. Proof that our lives happened. Proof we mattered to someone once. Mrs. Harper helped me search for nearly 20 minutes before she finally whispered, "Margaret, garbage collection came this afternoon." I stopped moving. Slowly, the words settled inside me. Came this afternoon. The bags I was opening now were only leftovers from neighboring houses. Emily's trash was already gone. Gone. I remember staring at my bleeding hands while rainwater washed pink rivers into the gutter. Then suddenly, I couldn't breathe properly. Not from illness. From realization. The letters were truly gone. All 63 of them. Every birthday letter. Every anniversary note. Every apology. Every "I miss you." Gone beneath piles of city waste somewhere I would never reach. I made one terrible sound then. Not a scream. Not crying. Something smaller. The sound a person makes when their heart cracks quietly inside their chest. Mrs. Harper wrapped her arms around me right there beside the dumpsters while I shook like a child. And all I could think was, Walter would never forgive me for losing them. I know that sounds ridiculous. Dead men do not judge us. But widows continue conversations with ghosts long after funerals end. I spoke to Walter constantly after he died. While washing dishes. While folding laundry. While lying awake at 3 a.m. listening to the refrigerator hum in an empty house. I told him when Emily forgot my birthday one year. I told him when arthritis spread to my hands. I even told him when I finally threw away his old slippers because I could no longer bear seeing them by the bed. Now I imagine telling him this. I lost your letters. The only pieces of you left. And I could almost hear his response too. Oh, Maggie. That's what he called me. Maggie. Only him. After Mrs. Harper helped me inside, Emily was standing near the front door with crossed arms. I'll never forget how irritated she looked. Not worried. Not guilty. Annoyed. You embarrassed me, she said immediately. Mrs. Harper turned toward her so sharply I thought she might slap her. Your mother was outside digging through trash in the rain. Emily sighed. Because she's overreacting. Overreacting. That word again. Funny how people use it whenever emotions inconvenience them. I walked past both of them without speaking. At that moment, silence felt more dangerous than anger. My bedroom smelled faintly like lavender detergent and old books. Usually it comforted me. Not that night. That night it felt empty. Violently empty. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the shelf where the wooden box had been. The square outline remained untouched beneath the dust. I reached out and traced it again. And suddenly memories started coming so fast I could barely hold them. Walter writing letters at the kitchen table. Walter sealing envelopes with crooked smiles. Walter pretending not to notice when I reread old letters during hard times. Especially during hard times. Oh, those letters saved our marriage more than once. People think long marriages survive because couples never change. That's nonsense. Long marriages survive because couples forgive change. Walter wasn't the same man at 60 that he was at 25. Neither was I. We disappointed each other many times. There were years when exhaustion replaced romance. Years when money problems poisoned entire months. Years when we barely spoke except about bills and Emily's school schedules. But then a letter would appear. Sometimes left beside my coffee cup before dawn. Sometimes tucked into my purse. Sometimes mailed to the house even while he lived there because he knew written words reached me differently. One letter came after the worst fight we ever had. Emily was 16 then. Rebellious. Angry at everything. Walter thought I was too soft on her. I thought he was too strict. That night we screamed at each other so loudly Emily locked herself in her room crying. I told Walter he frightened people when he got angry. And he shouted back, maybe because nobody listens until I do. Then he slammed the door and disappeared for hours. I truly believed our marriage cracked permanently that night. But the next morning, I found a letter beside the toaster. I can still remember pieces of it. Maggie. Sometimes I become my father without meaning to. And every time I see fear in your eyes, I hate myself for it. You are not my enemy. You never were. The world exhausts me sometimes, but you have never been the weight I carry. You are the reason I carry it. I must have read that letter 1,000 times over the years. Especially after his death. Especially on lonely nights. Now someone had thrown it into garbage. Can you understand why that felt unbearable? Those letters weren't just romance. They were history. They held versions of Walter even I had forgotten. The hopeful young husband. The terrified new father. The exhausted provider. The aging man scared of retirement. The grieving son after his mother died. The frightened patient after his first heart attack. All preserved in ink. And now erased. I don't know how long I sat there before Emily entered my room. She knocked first, but only halfway. Like politeness had become obligation. Mom. I didn't answer. I didn't know they meant that much. I looked up slowly then. You never asked. She shifted uncomfortably. Well, you never talked about them. That stunned me for a moment. Because she was right. I hadn't. Not really. The letters belonged to Walter and me. Private things. Sacred things. Children aren't supposed to carry the emotional weight of their parents' marriage. So I protected those memories quietly. Maybe too quietly. Emily sat on the desk chair with a long sigh. I thought they were just old papers. Old papers. Again. I studied her face carefully then. My daughter was 52 years old herself by that point. Divorced twice. Always rushing somewhere emotionally. Beautiful still, though tired around the eyes. And suddenly, I realized something heartbreaking. No one had ever loved her the way Walter loved me. Not once. Not completely. Maybe that's why she couldn't understand. How could she value love letters when she had never received real ones herself? Her first husband cheated constantly. Her second husband treated affection like a transaction. Flowers after guilt. Apologies without change. I used to pray she'd someday experience the kind of steady devotion Walter gave me so naturally. But life doesn't distribute love fairly. Some people starve beside others who feast. Emily rubbed her temples. I've had a stressful week, Mom. I almost laughed. As though stress explained everything. I wasn't thinking. No, I whispered. You weren't. That hurt her. I saw it immediately. But grief had stripped softness from me temporarily. She looked away. I said I'm sorry. Did she mean it? Maybe. But some apologies arrive too late to prevent damage. That's another lesson marriage teaches you. Timing matters. Walter understood timing beautifully. He knew exactly when to speak and when silence healed better. Emily had inherited neither his patience nor his emotional instincts. Maybe that was my fault too. I raised her to survive. Not necessarily to feel deeply. There's a difference. After a long silence, she finally asked quietly. What was in them? That question nearly destroyed me. Because suddenly I wanted to tell her everything. About the letter Walter wrote after my miscarriage before Emily was born. About the letter he wrote from the hospital after cancer surgery where he confessed he feared dying more because of leaving me than because of death itself. About the tiny note he slipped into my purse on our 40th anniversary that simply read, "Still my favorite person." 40 years together, and that man still looked at me like a miracle. I swallowed hard. Your father loved me very much. Emily stared down at her hands. Then softly. I know. No, I said before I could stop myself. I don't think you do. The room became very quiet after that. Outside, rain tapped against the windows steadily. Emily looked wounded now. Not angry. Just wounded. And suddenly exhaustion hit me harder than grief. I was too old for bitterness. Too old for war with my own child. But forgiveness had not arrived yet either. That's the uncomfortable truth nobody tells you. Forgiveness is not immediate for good people. Sometimes it takes time. Sometimes love and anger sit together inside you like strangers forced onto the same bus. Emily stood slowly. I really am sorry, Mom. I nodded faintly. But inside, something still ached too deeply to answer her properly. She hesitated near the door. Then she said quietly, "There was one letter on top when I threw the box away." My heart stopped. One. I accidentally read part of it. Suddenly every nerve in my body woke up. What did it say? Emily's eyes filled unexpectedly with tears. And in that moment, I realized something had happened while she read it. Something important. Something she hadn't yet fully admitted. She swallowed hard before speaking. He wrote, her voice cracked slightly, he wrote that he hoped someday I would find someone who loved me the way he loved you. I froze. Because I remembered that letter instantly. Walter wrote it on Emily's wedding day. And suddenly, for the first time since the letters disappeared, I saw pain in my daughter's face too. Real pain. Not irritation. Not defensiveness. Pain. And that changed everything a little. Not enough to heal me, but enough to make me wonder what exactly she felt when she threw that box away. And what she discovered too late after reading that final letter. Emily stood frozen in the doorway after telling me about the letter. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows, and somewhere downstairs the dryer buzzed faintly. Ordinary sounds. Everyday sounds. Funny how life keeps moving even while your heart is breaking. I looked at my daughter carefully then. Really looked at her. Her mascara had smudged slightly beneath her eyes. Her shoulders seemed smaller somehow. Tired. Defeated. And suddenly I saw not the grown woman who threw away my memories, but the little girl who used to wait by the front window every evening for her father to come home. Walter adored Emily. God, he adored her. The first time he held her, he cried so hard the nurse laughed at him. I didn't know something this beautiful could belong to me, he whispered. He spent years believing he wasn't good enough for us. That was the tragedy of my husband. The better man he became, the less he seemed able to see it. Emily used to climb onto his lap while he read newspapers after work. He'd pretend to complain. Can't even read headlines in peace around here. But his arms always wrapped around her automatically. Always. I remember one winter when Emily was 8 years old and desperately wanted a red bicycle for Christmas. We had no money. None. The heating bill was overdue, our refrigerator barely worked, and Walter's work hours had been cut. I told him gently we simply couldn't afford it. He nodded quietly. Never argued. Then on Christmas morning, there it was. A red bicycle with a white ribbon tied around the handlebars. Emily screamed so loudly the neighbors heard her. She hugged Walter around the neck while crying happy tears, and he just smiled like seeing her joy was worth anything. Only years later did I discover he'd sold his father's old watch to buy that bicycle. That's who my husband was. A man who quietly sacrificed pieces of himself for the people he loved. And maybe that's why losing those letters felt unbearable. They were evidence that men like Walter truly existed. The world feels crueler without proof of goodness. Emily finally broke the silence. I didn't know Dad wrote things like that. He wrote many things. She looked down again. I only read part of the letter. I nodded slowly. Walter's wedding day letter to Emily had been one of the longest he ever wrote. He stayed awake until nearly 3 in the morning writing it at our kitchen table. I remember waking up and finding him there in his robe with reading glasses sliding down his nose. You coming to bed? I asked. In a minute. But he stayed another hour writing carefully. The next day, before Emily walked down the aisle, he handed her the envelope. She cried after reading it privately in the church bathroom. At the time, I thought they were happy tears. Now I wonder. Maybe even then, some part of her feared she wasn't marrying the right man. A mother notices things too late sometimes. That realization haunts you. Emily cleared her throat softly. Dad really loved you, didn't he? The question nearly shattered me. Because she asked it like someone discovering love for the first time. I smiled sadly. Yes. Then after a pause. And I loved him. Not perfectly. That's important. People romanticize old marriages too much. Walter and I weren't magical creatures floating through life hand in hand. We hurt each other sometimes. I could be sharp-tongued when stressed. Walter withdrew emotionally when overwhelmed. There were nights we slept back to back in silence. Months where exhaustion replaced tenderness. But underneath everything, there was commitment. Not the modern kind people post about online. The quiet kind. The kind that wakes up at 2 a.m. to hold a bucket while your spouse vomits from chemotherapy. The kind that learns exactly how much sugar the other person likes in their coffee after 40 years and still remembers. The kind that stays. Even when staying becomes difficult. Especially then. Emily sat back down slowly. When Dad died, she hesitated. I was jealous of you. That surprised me so much I forgot my grief for a moment. Jealous? She nodded faintly. You had something I never did. I stared at her. And suddenly, pieces of my daughter's life rearranged themselves painfully in my mind. Her first marriage ending after betrayal. Her second ending in coldness. All those years she pretended independence was enough. All those years she mocked sentimentality. Maybe she wasn't mocking it at all. Maybe she was mourning its absence. I used to watch you and Dad together, she whispered. Even when you got older, you still looked at each other differently. My throat tightened. Walter did look at me differently. Even near the end. Especially near the end. The last year of his life was hard. Heart problems. Medications. Fatigue. He became thinner. Slower. Sometimes he'd forget words mid-sentence and grow embarrassed. But every night before sleeping, he still reached for my hand under the blankets. Every single night. Once, during his final hospital stay, I apologized for growing old beside him. Can you imagine such foolishness? As though aging together was tragedy instead of privilege. Walter squeezed my fingers weakly and said, Maggie, loving your face through time has been my life's honor. I had written those words down afterward because I was afraid memory alone couldn't carry them safely. And now, the paper holding those words was gone. Emily rubbed at her eyes suddenly. I think I hated those letters before I even knew what they were. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? She gave a broken little laugh. Because somebody loved you enough to write them. Oh. Oh, my poor girl. That was it. Not cruelty. Not carelessness alone. Grief of another kind. The grief of never being cherished properly. I wish I could say I immediately forgave her then. But hearts don't heal in perfect movie moments. Part of me still ached violently. Still wanted those letters back. Still felt angry every time I imagined garbage trucks carrying Walter's handwriting away forever. But another part of me, the mother part, suddenly saw Emily's loneliness clearly for the first time in years. Loneliness can make people careless with other people's treasures. Because if you've never held treasure yourself, sometimes you don't recognize it. We sat quietly a while after that. Then Emily said something unexpected. I went back after you came inside. I blinked. What? To the trash bins. My breath caught. I looked too. For a second, hope exploded painfully inside me again. Did you find? No, she whispered quickly. They were already gone. Disappointment hit so sharply I had to close my eyes. But beneath it came something else too. She had gone back. My daughter had returned to the rain and garbage after all. Maybe because guilt finally reached her. Or maybe because she suddenly understood what those letters truly were. Either way, she tried. And sometimes effort matters even after failure. Emily twisted her wedding ring from her second marriage absently, though she'd been divorced 3 years already. Habit. People cling to habits after love leaves. I found something else though, she said quietly. I looked up. What? She hesitated. Then reached into her sweater pocket slowly. My heart stopped. In her hand was a tiny folded piece of yellow paper. Not a letter. A note. I recognized Walter's handwriting instantly. My vision blurred immediately. Where did you get that? It was stuck at the bottom of the trash bin, she whispered. My hands shook violently as she passed it to me. The paper was damp and smelled faintly like coffee grounds, but the ink remained visible. I unfolded it carefully. And there it was. Walter's crooked handwriting. My Maggie. If you're reading this after I'm gone, then I probably loved you for an entire lifetime and still wished for more. Thank you for making ordinary days feel important. W. That was all. Just that. One tiny note. Probably tucked between letters years ago and accidentally separated from the others. But the moment I saw his handwriting again, I broke. Completely. Not graceful tears. Not quiet sadness. Real grief. The kind that bends your body forward. I covered my mouth while sobs escaped me like something torn open after years held shut. Because suddenly Walter existed again for one impossible moment. Not memory. Not imagination. Him. His hand. His words. Emily rushed beside me then, kneeling by the bed. I'm sorry, she cried. Mom, I'm so sorry. And hearing my daughter cry finally undid the last of my anger. Not because the pain vanished, but because pain had become shared now. She understood. Too late, yes. But truly. I reached for her hand while clutching Walter's note in the other. And for the first time in years, Emily leaned against me the way she used to as a child. Small. Vulnerable. Human. We cried together for a long time. For Walter. For the letters. For failed marriages. For all the ways people love each other imperfectly. Then eventually Emily whispered something against my shoulder that nearly stopped my heart. There may be more. I pulled back immediately. What? She wiped her face. When I threw the box away, I remember some loose papers falling onto the garage floor. My pulse quickened violently. You didn't tell me this before. I forgot until now, she said quickly. Everything happened so fast. Where are they? I don't know. Maybe they got swept somewhere. Suddenly hope returned so sharply it hurt. Not all 63 letters. But maybe something. Anything. A page. A fragment. One more piece of Walter. Emily stood immediately. Let's check the garage. It was nearly midnight by then. Rain still fell outside. My knees hurt. My back ached. But none of that mattered anymore. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, there was a possibility. A tiny one. But enough. And as my daughter helped me slowly toward the garage together, Walter's tiny rescued note trembling in my hand. I realized something strange. Maybe the letters were never only about preserving the past. Maybe somehow, even now, Walter was still trying to repair something between us. The garage smelled like wet concrete, old paint, and dust. Walter used to love this garage. Not because it was beautiful. Lord, it was a disaster most of the time. But because it gave him space to make things with his hands. Crooked shelves. Birdhouses that leaned sideways. A kitchen table that wobbled for 15 years because he refused to admit one leg was shorter than the others. This table has personality, he'd insist proudly. I stood just inside the doorway while Emily switched on the overhead light. The bulb flickered twice before glowing weakly yellow across stacks of boxes and forgotten tools. For a moment, neither of us moved. Hope can be terrifying when you've already prepared yourself for loss. Emily started checking near the garbage cans first. I think some papers fell around here. I nodded, clutching Walter's rescued note tightly against my chest. My knees hurt terribly, but I lowered myself slowly beside an old shelf and began searching through scattered newspapers, empty paint cans, and flattened cardboard. Dust coated everything. My fingertips trembled. Every tiny scrap of paper made my heart jump. Most were nothing. Old receipts. Expired coupons. Instruction manuals. But then, I saw it. A corner of cream-colored paper sticking out beneath a workbench. My breath caught instantly. Emily. She turned quickly. I pointed silently because suddenly I couldn't speak. Emily crouched and carefully pulled the paper free. The moment I saw Walter's handwriting, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. Oh my God. It wasn't just a note. It was an entire letter. Folded twice. Slightly dirty along one edge, but untouched otherwise. Emily handed it to me like it was fragile glass. Maybe it was. Some things break without physically tearing. I unfolded it slowly. The date at the top made my chest ache immediately. June 14, 1989. The summer we nearly lost our house. I remembered that year instantly. Walter's railway station reduced staff hours after budget cuts. Bills piled higher every month. Emily needed braces we couldn't afford. I cried almost every night back then after everyone went to sleep. But I never realized how frightened Walter was too until I read this letter years later. Now, standing in that dim garage, I read it again aloud through shaking breaths. Maggie. I know you think I don't notice how scared you are lately. I do. You hide it in little ways. Cleaning when you're nervous. Pretending headaches when bills come in the mail. I wish I could give you an easier life. God knows I've tried. But if all I ever manage to give you is a man who comes home every night loving you with his whole heart, then I hope someday that will feel like enough. Because it's the truest thing I own. By the time I finished reading, both Emily and I were crying again. But softer this time. Not shattered grief. Something gentler. Like healing finally beginning to move through the cracks. Emily covered her mouth. He really wrote like that all the time? I smiled through tears. Yes. He talked to you like you were, she paused emotionally, important. I looked at my daughter then. Really looked at her. And suddenly I understood something painful. Emily had spent most of her life feeling tolerated instead of treasured. No wonder those letters confused her. She had survived relationships. I had survived inside love. There's a difference. A terrible difference. We kept searching after that. For nearly an hour. Most of the garage held only dust and disappointment. But beneath an old toolbox, we found another letter. Then half of one torn along the edge. Then 3 more pages scattered behind storage bins. Only fragments of the original box. But enough. Enough to bring pieces of Walter back into the room. Each letter carried his soul so clearly. One contained a terrible little joke about my cooking. One apologized for forgetting our anniversary in 1978. One simply described how beautiful I looked sleeping beside the window during a thunderstorm. Ordinary moments. That's what made them sacred. Not grand declarations. Daily devotion. People misunderstand marriage terribly nowadays. They think love survives on passion alone. But passion burns hot and fast. What carries people across decades is attention. Remembering. Choosing tenderness repeatedly in small unnoticed ways. Walter mastered small unnoticed ways. Emily sat cross-legged on the garage floor reading one recovered letter silently while tears slipped down her cheeks. Then suddenly she whispered, "I don't think anyone ever loved me like this." The honesty in her voice broke my heart. I moved carefully beside her despite my aching joints. "Oh, sweetheart." "No," she said quickly, wiping her face. "It's true." She laughed weakly after that. Maybe that's why I became so cynical. I took her hand. "There's still time." "For what?" "To be loved properly." She looked away immediately. At 52, hope embarrassed her. That's what repeated disappointment does to people. It makes optimism feel childish. But I squeezed her fingers gently. "Your father used to say the saddest thing in life wasn't growing old." Emily glanced up. "What was it?" "Settling for less love than you deserve because you think time is running out." Walter said that after Emily's second divorce. He worried about her constantly near the end of his life. Not because she was unsuccessful. Because she was lonely. Parents know. Even when adult children pretend otherwise, we know. Emily stared at the recovered letters spread across the floor. "I used to think you and Dad were unrealistic." I smiled faintly. "We were realistic every single day." That's the irony. Long marriages aren't fairy tales. They are built inside grocery stores and hospital rooms and exhausted conversations after work. Walter and I chose each other during ordinary Tuesdays over and over again. That's what made it extraordinary. Emily picked up another letter carefully. "Do you think relationships like yours still exist?" I thought about that for a long moment. Then answered honestly. "Yes." She looked surprised. "But they're rarer now because people leave too quickly." "Sometimes leaving is necessary." "Yes," I agreed softly. "Sometimes it is." I would never tell a woman to stay where she is unloved or unsafe. But modern people often confuse discomfort with failure. Love becomes inconvenient, and suddenly they think it's gone. Walter and I survived because we stayed curious about each other even during hard years. We kept trying to understand instead of simply react. The garage grew quiet again after that. Rain still drummed softly outside. Midnight had long passed. And there we sat, mother and daughter, surrounded by dusty fragments of a dead man's handwriting. Healing. Not completely. Maybe not ever completely. But honestly. Eventually Emily spoke again. "I think Dad left those letters for more than just you." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "He was teaching people how to love." That sentence settled deep inside me. Because she was right. Walter never intended those letters to become literature or legacy. But somehow they had become exactly that. Proof. Instruction. Evidence that steady love existed in an impatient world. Emily suddenly stood and walked toward an old cabinet near the back wall. "What are you looking for?" I asked. She opened the bottom drawer slowly, then turned toward me with watery eyes and a tiny smile. "You're not the only one who saved things." From the drawer, she pulled out a faded envelope. I stared at it in confusion. Then my breath stopped. It was addressed in Walter's handwriting. To Emily. "This was in my keepsake box," she whispered. "I forgot about it for years." Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope carefully. Inside was another letter from Walter. Unsentimental at first glance. Simple paper. Blue ink. But the moment Emily began reading aloud, both of us cried again. "Emmy, one day you'll understand that the greatest thing your mother ever gave me was not perfection. It was safety. She made life feel less frightening. And if you ever find someone who makes your soul feel safe instead of merely excited, hold on tightly." Emily's voice cracked completely after that. She couldn't continue. So I finished the final line softly for her because I remembered Walter writing it years ago. Excitement fades. Safety becomes home. Silence filled the garage afterward. Heavy. Beautiful silence. Then Emily suddenly wrapped her arms around me. Not politely. Not carefully. Desperately. Like a daughter again. "I'm sorry," she whispered into my shoulder. "I'm so sorry about the letters." This time, forgiveness came naturally. Not because the loss no longer hurt. It always would. But because Walter would have chosen healing over punishment. That was the kind of man he was. I held my daughter tightly and whispered the truth at last. He would forgive you too. And somehow, saying that aloud healed something inside both of us. We didn't recover all the letters. Out of 63, we found 11 intact and pieces of several others. The rest were gone forever. But maybe forever isn't exactly the right word. Because after that night, Emily started asking questions about her father constantly. What music he loved. How we met. What our first apartment looked like. Why I stayed through hard years. And slowly, through stories and surviving letters, Walter returned to the family again. Not as a ghost. As inheritance. A few weeks later, Emily bought a beautiful wooden box. Handmade. Slightly crooked on one side. Just like Walter's. Inside it, we placed the recovered letters carefully together. But before closing the lid, Emily added something else. A handwritten note of her own. I asked what it said. She smiled sadly and answered. Just trying to continue the tradition. Sometimes I think that's all love really is. One person handing tenderness to another before time runs out. And even now, late at night, I still reread Walter's surviving letters beside my bedroom lamp. My eyesight isn't what it used to be. My hands ache. And some mornings grief still arrives before breakfast. But when I touch his handwriting, I remember. I remember being loved fully. I remember ordinary days made sacred. And I remember that although death may silence a voice, real love leaves echoes strong enough to survive even garbage trucks, lost years, and broken hearts. That, I think, is what my husband was trying to tell me all along.